It's not a secret that China is facing one of the toughest demographics crises in the world. In fact, this is probably one of the most talked about problems facing Chinese society today. China's demographics is projected to be halved by 2100, with large segment of the population being extremely old. And people just aren't having enough children to not only support these growing numbers of aging population, but they're also not having enough children to replace them in the future. On top of this, China also faces problems with their gender imbalance, where it has 117 boys for every 100 girls, due to the enactment of one-child policy and China's general preference for the male over the female. In fact, it is believed that there are 35 million more men than women in China, which is now making it very difficult for many of these men to find a partner. Yet, despite how frequently it is talked about, one thing that I very rarely see is how China and its government views this problem, and what they see as a solution for it. So that is what we're going to talk about today in this video, because for something that is repeated so heavily, you should at least be aware of how they view the issue. But first, we need to talk a little bit about the details of China's demographics, because the consensus on what China's actual population size is, or the accuracy of their demographics makeup, is actually a lot more controversial than you think. For example, there are people who claim that China's population is actually 100 million people smaller than what is actually being reported, and that their population projection is actually a lot worse than what it seems. The most famous proponent of this idea is geopolitical analyst Peter Zeihan.
The worst in the world is China. They've been in the process of updating their data over the course of the last couple of years, and they're now starting to publicly admit that they overcounted by 100 million people. All of those people would have been born since one child, so age 40 and under, the young worker demographic, the childbearing demographic, and 2/3 of them are probably women. So best guess is that China only has 1.3 billion people now. The population probably peaked more than 10 years ago. And by 2030, there will be more retirees than workers. And by 2050, the entire population of China will have dropped below 650 million.
That's wild.
It's beyond terminal. Yeah, so the Chinese system collapses this decade for sure.
Now, despite Peter Zeihan's claims, China has actually never admitted to overcounting their population by 100 million. And Peter Zeihan's claims about China's population being around 100 million people less actually comes from one academic, Professor Fu Shanyi, senior scientist at University of Wisconsin, who claims that China's demographics is shrinking much faster than what is being reported, with their real fertility rate being much lower, with their real population being 1.28 billion rather than 1.4 billion, and that their population has been shrinking since 2018. But the problem is that despite this being way too often parroted, its conclusion is actually not the consensus at all, with many academics even pushing back against this claim, such as Dr. Fang Wang at the University of California, Irvine, who claims that although China does have a serious issue with their demographics problem, that what Dr. Fu Shanyi is claiming is unsubstantiated, and that others have looked at the data and have not seen the discrepancy that Dr. Fu Shanyi is referring to. And admittedly, I wasn't able to find the hard math on this anywhere, and it doesn't seem like Peter Zeihan himself has confirmed the data other than some kind of faith that he is right. On the other hand, there are also people who claim that China's demographics is actually a lot better than what is being reported. This is because there are millions of women in China appearing out of nowhere each year, due to them having not been officially registered within the Chinese government's population database. The reason for this is that despite China's implementation of one-child policy, it was actually very poorly enforced due to China being a backwater and chaotic country during that period. Many people still had more than one children, and they simply just didn't register their extra child, with parents often opting to just register their male children to carry their family name. And it seems like there was just an agreement between everyone in various local towns and villages to just look the other way as long as people weren't causing trouble. And according to Dr. John Kennedy at University of Kansas, it's possible that there are around 25 million women that are unregistered, and possibly even more, which is actually enough number that would make the gender ratio not as big of an issue. Now, there are arguments against this argument as well, and we're just scratching the surface of this topic, and you could quite literally just do a 1-hour video on this topic alone. However, regardless of which side is right, China today isn't having enough kids, and the conclusion is that China's demographics is either really bad or really, really bad. So with all this, we're just going to assume that China's population is actually what they report as, which is still bad no matter how you try to spin it, and it probably is close to accurate anyways. There are also other weird assumptions that is often made about China's demographics problem, especially relating to gender imbalance. For example, one argument that I will often hear is that because China has more male than female, there will be a lot of frustrated young Chinese men who can't find a wife, which will somehow lead to societal instability. For the record, there is no evidence to support that the inability to find a girlfriend and get laid results in uptick of violence and societal instability. It's an assumption based on the trend we see in the West, where there's been an uptick of lonely, frustrated men, or commonly known as incels, who subscribe to political extremism and violence. But we also see in countries like Japan, where there's a large population of men that aren't able to find a girlfriend or a wife, that there hasn't been more violence or led to political instability. The lonely male epidemic in the West is a lot more complicated than just the inability to find a girlfriend or wife. And in fact, you could argue that trying to downplay the problems faced by men in the West as just their inability to get laid, all without critically analyzing why these people are falling out of society, is precisely the reason why many are beginning to subscribe to extremist ideology. There are also some who argue that gender imbalance in China is a good thing. This is because the difficulty in finding a wife due to smaller female population means that men must improve their competitiveness in the marriage market. And this seems to also encourage some to become entrepreneurs or take on more difficult and even dangerous jobs so that they can become wealthy and find a wife, with positive effect on labor. But to be honest, even with evidence, this just sounds like a massive cope to me. However, it was an interesting working paper released in the National Bureau of Economics Research, so I thought I'd mention it. The most important thing to take away from China's gender imbalance is precisely that there are excess number of men who will likely not have babies, meaning that they will not have children to support them and won't have children to support the declining population of the country, which will put a tremendous amount of strain on the economy as there will be less retirees than workers, which is in line with the general problems with China's demographics. In the West, the primary solution to demographics problem is simply to rely heavily on immigration, and it doesn't seem like China is too particularly interested in replicating that policy. We see throughout Europe that sometimes bringing mass migration while other problems persist can exacerbate and even cause bigger issues in the long run, and in some cases it could cause serious diplomatic problems like the ones involving Canada and India and the alleged assassination of Canadian Sikh separatist/independence leader on Canadian soil. However, just because China is not interested in replicating West's migration policy does not mean that China has no interest in bringing talent into the country, because one thing that China has been increasingly doing in the past 2 years is focusing on bringing Chinese diaspora back to the country. Essentially, China is increasingly opening their country up to ethnically Chinese people, including those born outside of China. In fact, there are approximately 60 million Chinese people living outside of China, a population size slightly bigger than Italy's, with the top 3 largest diaspora population being Thai, Malaysian, and American Chinese. And in places like the United States, where Chinese scientists are increasingly being targeted and profiled with the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes, many well-educated Chinese scientists are choosing to move back to China instead. In 2021 alone, 1,400 Chinese scientists left America to China. Now, you might not think that 1,400 Chinese scientists are a lot until you realize that many of these are PhD-level scientists, meaning that these are some of the most valuable groups of immigrants. Now, in the past, China did have things like the 1,000 Talent Program established in 2008, which focused on bringing expertise back to the country. But this newer diaspora policy introduced by President Xi Jinping seems to have much broader goals, with Beijing now seeing all 60 million as Chinese nationals regardless of their citizenship status, with Chinese leader Xi Jinping even openly calling to the diaspora, citing that the Chinese sons and daughters at home and abroad should be united for the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And we know that an overwhelming number of green cards to foreigners in China go to ethnically Chinese people. So if hypothetically China could attract even a bit of that 60 million Chinese diaspora, that is potentially hundreds of thousands of newly highly educated workforce that could contribute to its society. And that's at the very lowest. And China benefits from this policy, all without the same negative consequence of bringing migrants that you see in many Western countries as well. Outside of bringing ethnically Chinese people back into the country, China has also introduced aggressive reforms to increase the productivity of workers and make its economy more efficient, with the goal of having every worker outproduce and outwork its foreign competitors. And this is the next and the primary element that China is relying on to beat their demographics crisis. We know from countries like Bulgaria that even if a country has one of the sharpest decline in population, you can still grow your economy by helping workers and businesses become more productive and efficient through structural reform, all without relying on mass migration. And China, despite being the second largest economy in the world, still actually has a very low productivity, lower than countries like Venezuela and Sri Lanka. So if in theory China could grow their productivity, they could not only offset the damages of the aging population, but enough to keep growing past it. One way to increase this low productivity is by getting its population to become more urbanized, because China still only has an urbanization rate of 65%. And urbanized workers in China tend to produce twice to 3 times that of your rural workers. And even in rural areas of China, many farmers are still under-equipped compared to farmers in other countries, and China has been speeding up its modernization efforts. China has also developed new ways of farming, like developing rice that can grow in seawater, which has doubled the yield within the same time alone with less resources. And this was actually a pretty big breakthrough. And according to Think Tank Report, if China were to focus on urbanization, they should be able to delay the downturns of demographics crisis for another decade just by urbanization alone, despite the fact that their population have already peaked. And all this is without taking into consideration of the integration of robotics and AI within the workforce to make people more efficient, which if considered could in theory offset the overall negative impact of aging population in general, but that this policy is too new for us to tell. China is probably one of the few countries that has actually taken comprehensive top-down steps to integrate robotics and AI into workforce. For example, just in 2022, China installed more robots than the entire world has. And this installation of robotics is definitely an ongoing trend in 2023 and 2024 as well, because it is heavily pushed top-down by the government. In fact, it will speed up if anything. This mass adoption of automation also means that China could offset the burden of the lack of workers relative to retirees, something that is now beginning to catch the attention of everyone around the world as an emerging phenomenon in China in combating aging population. Now, you might think that this is all just talk, but I want to give you a real example of this.
I'm here in Tianjin Port, one of the largest in the world. Behind me here, you see a lot of autonomous vehicles moving cargo around. One thing you don't see are any people, just because everything is automated.
China recently built the first fully autonomous smart port that's setting new records for its speed and efficiency. This was done on the backs of Huawei's 5G, AI, and more. And what this means is that while your traditional port might need a worker to be up on a crane and actually operate those cranes to service one ship at a time, one worker is now simply monitoring and serving multiple cranes and ships all inside a control room where it is just automatically done by the computer with a takeover rate of 0.1%. This means that it requires a fraction of workers to manage these compared to its foreign counterpart, such as the United States, who is having trouble adapting to these changes due to focus on short-term profits and opposition from labor unions. And they are, of course, very open about the fact that this will help with the aging population. I promise that what I'm presenting to you is not an over-exaggeration. It is a very real thing that is happening. If you go to big cities in China, you will see autonomous street cleaners. In fact, they're going to have 300,000 of them by next year. You will see drones delivering food. In places like Shenzhen, this is just the norm now. And China is testing driverless cars than any other country, which is supported very strongly by the government. And you will see mass adoption of automation in factories like never before, all subsidized very heavily. These are real things that are happening, and it really does feel like it just happened overnight. And in fact, the US government itself is acutely aware of this. In a report by Congressional Research Service, a major legislative agency that supports the US Congress, they spell it out that China is investing into innovation, education, digital infrastructure, advanced manufacturing, and emerging technologies to boost their growth and productivity, and that this industrial policy is a very big concern of the Biden administration as it can distort the market. Now, would focus on increasing productivity and efficiency through technology actually work in the long run? Well, according to a report by Harvard Business Review back in 2019, China could actually, in theory, offset their problems of demographics by increasing productivity, such as integration of high tech, which seems to also be corroborated by other papers in this video as well. But that the road to it is riddled with difficult problems, primarily being poor management due to Chinese companies being very top-down and conservative, similar to the Japanese, who also have a difficult time with their productivity. However, since this article was released in 2019, China has actually addressed many of the problems outlined in the article, and Harvard Business Review has released other articles like the ones in 2023 highlighting China's new highly efficient management system that has prioritized pragmatic approach to innovation. And this was done by providing great levels of group autonomy at scale, even beyond that of Western companies, replacing useless bureaucracy with fast responsive digital platform that can better centralize and coordinate teams, and just having a very clearly defined long-term goals that prioritize collective interest over the individual interest. In fact, we see some of the results of this today with the emergence of China's highly competitive and innovative tech companies. Companies like BYD didn't just come out of nowhere overnight. It was a decade-long process spearheaded by policies of President Xi Jinping, something that everyone should have seen coming, yet didn't because nobody took what he said seriously. And this is why I make these videos, so you understand that there are things happening behind the scenes that you don't even know is happening until it actually all suddenly comes together seemingly overnight. President Xi Jinping has even labeled this new economic model as the new quality productive forces just recently, citing that it will be a new model that will focus on things like high tech, high efficiency, and high quality, which will free the country from old economic model, the same model that requires, as an example, mass migration for continuous GDP growth. And by doing so, China plans to overcome the so-called middle income trap, a trap where a country won't be able to compete in manufacturing because their wages are no longer cheap, because wages can be high if you're producing top quality technologies, as highlighted as far back as 2015 when President Xi unveiled the Made in China 2025 project. And because information about China's policies are very hard to get as it happens behind closed doors, all this is actually kind of just hand-waved as jargon in the West, when in reality there should be more digging and more investigations with more readings of their plans as far back as 20 years to put the puzzle pieces together.
As Ju mentioned, we don't really know what it means. Yeah, nobody knows what it means.
In fact, China's so-called overcapacity problem is also an extension of this new policy, as high-quality and affordable Chinese electric vehicles and other technologies are beginning to flood into the global market, something that was, again, in the works for a decade with plenty of time for Western countries to prepare if they actually took anything China said seriously. Despite the protectionist narrative that the only reason why these goods are competitive is due to Chinese subsidies and cheap labor, there has been strong pushback by economists and industry leaders over this claim.
By all means, impose tariffs on EVs and on batteries and on cellular, telephones or whatever, if in fact there is a lot of evidence that these are state subsidized. But please, oh please, please, don't bring this nonsensical argument of excess capacity. I'm a PhD in mathematical economics, I don't mind saying, and I don't mind a nice little quantitative definition here. Excess capacity is simply defined the output that can be produced reasonably with use of capacity minus inventories. I haven't seen anything like that being dedicated or somehow calculated in the case of China.
The truth is that the actual reason is more complicated. China has dominance over EV supply chain as well as efficient manufacturing due to vertical integration. And according to UBS, these companies are just better at engineering and innovation that gives them a significant cost advantage beyond just cheap labor, which is also corroborated by peer-reviewed studies in US and EU as well. Now, despite everything I mentioned, the conclusion of some seem to be that although the effect of this new policy on boosting productivity via integration of robotics and AI is too early to tell, it's unlikely to succeed as China's productivity won't go up but will continue to slow down, with lots of comparisons to Japan because China's issues mirrors that of the Japanese. This is because not only is Japan facing a severe demographics problem, much longer than China has actually, but it also has a very low productivity problem, in fact the lowest productivity in all of G7, a number that they were not able to raise with it actually declining. And like China, it was generally accepted that Japan could have helped itself from economic stagnation by raising productivity, which they never managed to do. The reason for Japan's low productivity is that the country has problems with things like outdated technological infrastructure because it is a society dominated by old people who typically have difficulty adapting to new technologies. And many parts of Japan are still riddled with unnecessary paperwork and just general inefficiencies, like during COVID-19 pandemic, where in order to update the number of outbreaks, the doctors would need to handwrite report for every single case and then send it via fax machine. Additionally, like the problems China used to have, Japan's productivity problem also stems from other things like poor organizational management, which also contributes to Japan increasingly struggling with innovation. Japan has actually been struggling with innovation in general. This is due to all sorts of reasons like being a culture that's resistant to changes, being risk-averse society, and having an underdeveloped ecosystem for startups and more. And they've been falling to a record low in global digital rankings as time goes on. But notice that China used to have this issue like Japan. Personally, I have always found this comparison between China and Japan odd because China is not Japan. China is different because unlike in Japan where they have to wait until old people finally adopt new technologies out of necessity, China has the advantage of forcing these companies to adopt them through top-down command economy. And if companies don't adopt them, they simply get outcompeted by other companies anyways, unlike in Japan where competition is less. Additionally, Chinese society isn't anal about doing everything by strict adherence to rules with absolutely zero deviation whatsoever, even if it's detrimental to the efficiency of the work. That is in fact a very unique feature of Japanese culture that you don't see anywhere else in the world. And unlike Japan that has stagnated in technological innovations, China is a rising power in it. Absolutely nobody can touch China and United States when it comes to pushing boundaries of technology at such a wide range of sectors like they do. On top of this, unlike Japan, we see that newer technologies are being readily adopted and integrated into Chinese society. I am personally not a big fan when China and Japan are compared to because it's clear to me when I read these comparisons that most people just have a very surface level understandings of these two countries and its culture and society. And it's also clear to me that there hasn't been that much thought into analyzing China's demographics, its relations to Chinese government, and how it views the problem despite it being such a big topic. There is also another thing that gets brought up often in regards to China's ability to raise productivity, which is that the country has a high debt level which will restrict their investment into things like automation and AI. Aside from the fact that we haven't seen any slowdown of investments, in fact China's spendings on science and technology is higher than ever before with a 10% increase from 2023 to 2024. Other than that, there's actually just a poor understanding of China's debt problem in general. And it's too complicated to talk about it in depth here, but essentially China is a lot more resilient to problems with their debt because most of their debt is domestic and they have high amounts of capital control with one of the highest saving rates in the world. This means that China's banks, which are state-owned, have high amounts of deposits that they can use to invest with, which is actually where most of their debt is from. And this deposit is growing secure, and stable, and China has enough money that can flow in to prevent any serious debt problem. And on top of this, most of the borrowers are Chinese state-owned companies and not private companies. This means that there is simply less vulnerability to market forces, with the government having more tools to step in if things get bad. Additionally, China actually runs a surplus at the national level, with the debt being concentrated at the local level, meaning that the surplus can also act as a buffer. There's more to it than that, but the most important part is that because they are much more resilient to problems with their debt, China can afford to have these debt as long as their economy continues to grow while keeping things at a sustainable level. The goal of investing into things like automation and AI is to encourage healthy growth anyways, and investment into things like science and technology actually tends to have better and healthy long-term returns than something like real estate, which used to be what China invested into. If you want to explore more about China's debt, there's actually a book by the chief economist at Bloomberg's Economics. The book is titled China, the Bubble That Never Pops, and he also has a talk on CSIS as well, and he covers some of the stuff that I just talked about. There are also other things like, yes, in a labor-scarce country like China, some argue that things like automation will augment labor and boost productivity, but it could also work too well and push people out of jobs, because these things don't just exist to make up the scarcity of labor, but also to replace existing ones. And actually, there is already fears from taxi drivers that their job will be replaced by automation soon. But a lot of these jobs that are being replaced, which are also jobs that elderlies are retiring from, are jobs which young people increasingly don't want anyways because they're much more educated than the previous generation. And really, if the effect of automation is as catastrophic as some are predicting, where it's going to end up replacing every job, then the world actually has bigger things to worry about. Outside of raising productivity of your everyday workers, China is also introducing what they call silver economy, which is an economy centered around old people that is expected to grow to 10% of the country's GDP by 2035. Actually, most people don't know this, but China has one of the lowest retirement age in the world at 60 years old for men and 55 years old for women. So one way that China is combating the pressure on economy is simply by getting people to work a little bit longer through raising a retirement age to something that is comparable to that of the United States. Although China has been slow with their pension reform, they have introduced things like new private pension program, alongside programs that provide cheap meals for elderlies via canteens and more. Additionally, China is building facilities and building up domestic tourist scenes specifically targeting elderlies. China lacks a lot of facilities and services for old people because for the last several decades, when all these infrastructures were being built, they were built for a largely working population. So this is a way for them to encourage elderlies to go out and keep spending money to stimulate the economy. This new silver economy is seen by some to be a really good opportunity for China because China has historically relied heavily on exports with weak domestic consumption. And the hope is that these new elderly population can contribute to help China gain a strong base of consumers, which has always been historically lacking. There are some fears that aging population will create higher demands for service industry, which are less productive than manufacturing, but China's service sector is severely lacking anyways, with tons of room to grow. So it's not necessarily bad to see it grow to a certain extent, as long as they're able to boost productivity and efficiency in service as well. There are other solutions that China is testing at a smaller scale. Like for example, China has been testing a government dating app in small city for a while now. Financial incentives, childcare allowances, tax breaks, and more are being tested to see if it has any strong effect on fertility rate. In the beginning of the video, I mentioned that China's population could be halved by 2100, but that's if nothing changes. In the best case scenario, it is not too late for China to stabilize the damages of aging population by raising the fertility rate. Of course, that is a lot harder said than done, but if they do succeed, this means that China could actually end up with 1.2 billion people rather than half, which is 700 million. Now, I know that the topic of China's demographics is usually in the context of whether it will affect them hard enough for them to continue posing a threat to US dominance, but this video really isn't about whether China will overtake the United States as the global hegemon, because that really shouldn't be China's priority anyways. It's more about whether they can use these tools to continue growing despite demographics crisis, even if it's slowly without stagnation, and perhaps even avoid a decline altogether. Forgetting about competition with the US for a second, in a hypothetical world where their growth does slow down, even being able to maintain a small incremental growth year over year despite this demographics crisis is still a big win. Of course, whether this will work or not is not guaranteed at all, and many economists believe that China should just abandon their failed model altogether and just move towards a more neoliberal model of opening their market up, bringing mass migration, developing a stronger consumer and service economy, and more. But at least now you know how China views this problem when the discussion of China's demographics comes up, and it's without a doubt an incredibly ambitious vision and something to keep an eye on.